Hello and welcome to I Can't Believe It's Not the Mouse, the podcast all about animation not made by the mouse. I'm your host, Octaviano, and today I'm revisiting a certain franchise. I've been wanting to do the sequel for years, and this just seems like the right time. When it comes to animation, one name looms large. That is Shrek. Big, iconic movie. Was the first one to win for animated feature at the Oscars, and it's often considered to be the animated film that for a lot of Western audiences convinced them that Disney was not the only studio out there. So obviously big deal. And then of course it was inevitable that a sequel would get made. Dreamworks, of course, has never been shy about the fact that they would do cash grab sequels. This is what happened here. The first one made money. It was a success. It was time to do a sequel. And yet, despite being a cash grab sequel, it's pretty amazing. Before we get started, I just want to say, if you're listening to this on YouTube, go ahead and give it a like, subscribe to the channel, feel free to comment, and ring the bell for notifications. Also, if you're on Spotify or just any other podcast site, follow this show on those platforms. Shrek 2 definitely shows, obviously, the later works would also continue to show this, but Shrek 2 to me is the one that really shows just what makes DreamWorks sequels work. Now, obviously, not all DreamWorks sequels are perfect. The sequel to this one isn't even all that good. The important thing is that despite the fact that DreamWorks is pretty much open about the fact that they make cash grab sequels, they also expand the world in ways that feel natural to the franchise they're doing. Now, I don't know if that's because they already have in mind, like, okay, we probably will get back to this if this movie is successful, so open it up to make more movies, or they're just that lucky, because it happens with everything, whether it's Kung Fu Panda, How to Train Your Dragon, or even the Trolls movies. I didn't even really care for the original Trolls. It's fine, but sequels really stepped it up a lot. It is really impressive to see that DreamWorks is just consistently good at this. And you can even see it here, because again, this was a cash grab sequel. There was no reason why this needed to be as good as it was. The first movie already did its job. This one could have easily sat back, relaxed, and just played the hits. But it didn't. It continued on in a very natural way, where it started asking, like, okay, well, why was Fiona trapped in a tower to begin with? Who are her parents? All that stuff. Like, what kingdom does she come from? And it results in this sort of meet the parents storyline that at first you think is like, okay, that's all it's going to be. But then, of course, it goes much deeper because it's a Shrek movie. It results in the reveal of, okay, well, the real mastermind behind all this stuff was, oddly enough, the person that in fairy tales is usually behind good things, the fairy godmother. And it's a very interesting twist. They could have just have it be like, okay, well, the villain of this movie is going to be either the father or Prince Charming, who opens up the movie the same way that Shrek did in the last one, but contrasts it by adding more lore to the story and, of course, trying to make it more epic because he's going on this big quest to save Fiona, even though she's already been rescued, because we saw the last movie. And they could have even left it at that, because that would have been the obvious thing. Like, we already got other stuff that have the pretty boy, hero that's turned into a bad guy. Like, by this point, Beauty and the Beast was already over a decade old. Gaston was old news, and they could have easily relied on that. But no, they decided to go the smarter route, where it's like, okay, well, Prince Charming is just a pretty boy idiot. We need a bigger mastermind behind us. And it only made sense that it would be the fairy godmother, who, in a funny twist to this movie, is the mother of Prince Charming. So it's like, not only is she trying to create a happily ever after to Fiona, she also is trying to get something for her son. And it's just really great stuff. That's the basic outline. I feel like I don't really need to explain this movie too much, because this is, of course, one of the most viewed animated movies of all time. It was a massive hit back in 2004. And, of course, even now, when they re-released it 20 years later, it did pretty well in the box office. So this movie, of course, has had a lasting effect. And again, it's just one of those movies where, surprisingly, it kept on doing the story really well. I mean, it never feels like a retread of the first movie, other than just, okay, well, now we eventually get the transformation stuff again, with, of course, Shrek deciding, okay, if she needs a Prince Charming, then I'll become human, and she'll be human again. But again, it doesn't feel like it's just retreading it. There is a natural way that it gets there. The franchise, of course, introduces one of the more popular characters in this one, with Puss in Boots, who's so good that, you kind of feel like he was always there to begin with, even though it wasn't until this movie that he was introduced. And yeah, it's just amazing stuff. There are a lot of people that I know that didn't like the first Shrek, who enjoyed this one a lot, which already tells you how good it is. Now, me personally, I'll be upfront. I prefer Shrek, the first movie, over this movie. I just think that the emotional weight on it, the story, it's all just much better. That being said, I do get why some people would prefer this one. It is a lot funnier, and it is filled with much more iconic scenes. For me, the main thing that kind of drags down, and it's something that, oddly enough, people complain about, yet they never really seem to complain about on this one, is the pop culture references. It's all over the place in this movie. And again, it's funny because this movie is very well beloved. A lot of people consider it one of the greatest sequels of all time. Like I said, some people even consider it better than the first movie. A lot of people do, really. And yet, it's filled to the brim with pop culture references, a lot of which I think still hold up, but then there's some stuff where it's like, I don't know if that's still funny anymore to a lot of people. Like, I still, like, watching it again, I was like, okay, look, I know what's being done here, but I don't know if someone younger is gonna care for, like, a joke of, like, oh, here's Sir Justin, or stuff like that. Like, they might understand, like, okay, that's probably some kind of actor or whatever, Justin Timberlake is still around, but it's not like he's like the teen heart at all that he was at that time. And this is not me disrespecting him. I think Justin Timberlake is fun. I mean, he's great in the Trolls movies. I'm just being real here. I don't know. It does, for the most part, it never really hurts the movie, and I do think there's a lot of really funny pop culture stuff, but I do kind of acknowledge that it is kind of an overload to a point where it's like, okay, some of these kind of miss even back then, and some of them will probably not age well over time, just because either people will forget about that thing, or we might find out something is kind of offensive about it. Like, I know, granted, there's some people who get mad about the opening with the wolf, especially because there's even a later joke where the fairy godmother, calls him a gender confused wolf. I don't mind that too much, just because I'm like, well, they're the bad guys. They're not gonna be treating anyone so well, but I do kind of get the offense there. I don't know. It's one of those movies where it's like, it has a joke overload to a point that it's like, yeah, there are a lot of great jokes in them, but some of it, doesn't hit too well, and because it is heavily reliant on pop culture references, it kind of feels lesser to me in that way, just because the first movie, even though it had its pop culture references and its fairy tale references, it still felt like its own unique story. Not as much here, but it doesn't really matter because it all still works so well. Again, though, isn't it kind of weird that people get mad about pop culture references, and they even, there even was a period where they would say, like, oh yeah, that's all DreamWorks did, and yet this movie always seems to get a pass because it's like, again, a lot of people acknowledge that it's really good, but it's like, you're talking about a movie that, within the span of minutes, you get references to the Beauty and the Beast, side characters, Indiana Jones, Pretty Woman, like, there's a lot of stuff where it's either name dropped or the characters acknowledge it. I mean, it's all over the place. It's done well. I will want to stress that as much as possible, but it is something that I kind of acknowledge where it's like, you guys go crazy over this when it comes to other things. Why not here? Again, I will say that at the very least, it is done well, and I love it, but yeah, I don't know. It is, like I said, a really funny movie, though. You could point at almost any scene and there is something really iconic or anything, and it's, you got funny stuff like, within the opening sequence, like, okay, you got the recreation of the first movie with the whole storybook thing. And of course, it's all building up to a big joke over like Fiona's already gone. Like if you've already seen the first movie, you already know she's out of the picture. So that reveal's funny. But then you get into the opening, Shrek and Fiona's honeymoon, and there's a lot of great gags in there. Again, a lot of pop culture references. There's like Spider-Man 2, Lord of the Rings, all over the place. But there is a lot of funny stuff like them being chased by villagers as they're going through a field of like dandelions, trying to hold hands and all that stuff. Ariel from The Little Mermaid, basically sneaks up on Shrek and kisses him while they're at a beach, and of course Fiona rightfully throws her back into the water, only to be eaten by sharks. Lots of funny stuff happened. I mean, there's of course the very iconic dinner scene, which is just joke after joke after joke. Love that whole sequence. The great climax. Like, this movie, of course, has one of the most well-known climaxes in any animated movie, Dreamworks or otherwise, as far as I'm concerned, where they're storming the castle using a giant gingerbread man. Lots of great jokes right there. You of course get a whole bit where they're walking through far, far away, and there's like their version of Starbucks, and there's a whole joke about like, okay, people run out of one Starbucks, across the street there's another one, and they hide right there. Funny stuff. Incredible. And then of course it amps up into a very epic climax where the fairy godmother starts singing Holding Out for a Hero, which originated from the movie Footloose. I'm not going to trash Footloose on that, but I will say between Footloose and this movie, this movie utilizes it way better as you see the characters storming through. There's, of course, jokes, like I've said before, and, you get, like, the whole tension of, like, oh, Fiona's dancing with Prince Charming, and we assume that she's taking a potion that is going to make her fall in love with him, and, will Shrek get there in time? Puss in Boots finally decides to lay down his life to stop these guards for Shrek. Incredible stuff. Kind of touched on Puss in Boots before, but I really want to highlight him. To any Shrek fan, you would assume that this character's been there all along, just because, he fits right into the universe so well. But again, remember, it was just this movie that introduced him, and he was just supposed to be a gag, because it was like, hey, look, Antonio Banderas was Zorro, let's get him to be Cat Zorro, essentially. And it's kind of funny that he's played Cat Zorro more than regular Zorro, but, well, something else to think about, maybe when I do one of the Puss in Boots movies. And, it's great stuff, because it's like, it just fits so well with the universe. It's funny to see his dynamic with Shrek, where he is kind of a kiss-ass, but at the same time, Shrek falls for it a lot more, or just wants to taunt Donkey with it. But regardless of it, he kisses ass Shrek as well, in his own way. Is kind of self-centered, conceited, all that stuff. Pretty much a lot of stuff that it feels kind of weird once you watch the Puss in Boots movies, to the point that you kind of feel like they should be in their own universe, even though they, especially with the second one, are connected to these. But hey, whatever, it's a cartoon. Don't think too much about it. Personally, I love Puss in Boots. I'm not gonna lie. I think he's a great character. I do think that when it comes to these movies, though, this is the only one that's ever fully utilized them right, with the Shrek universe. Shrek the Third, he's just kind of there, and the body swap thing, which, I'll get into whenever I do Shrek the Third, but the body swap thing is just kind of like, that's alright, I guess. Nothing too special. Shrek 4, he's there essentially to give some backstory to Fiona's situation, explains, like, what changed about Fiona in this universe. Otherwise, it's still kind of like, it's fine, but it's not as good as he was inserted here. Like, this was the perfect thing, and I don't know. I'm not saying that he shouldn't have been in the later movies because, of course, he is always a fun presence. I just do think that this was definitely one of those cases where he's so good that I understand why the other movies kept him in, but they never fully figured out what to do with him. Like, it'd be kind of like, I would say, like, when it comes to, like, the Toy Story movies with, you know, the introduction of Jessie, who just fits right into the movies. And she has her moments in 3 and 4, but, you know, in comparison to, like, the other stuff, the other characters, it never feels like, you know, like, oh, she's trying to be that important to the story. Like, it just feels like, okay, she has her little moments here and there. She has, you know, her bits of shine, but she's not in the main journey as much as she was in the second one. And I think that was kind of the balance that they should have gone with on this character. But, you know, he's there with the main journeys and the follow-ups, and as a result, again, I wouldn't say that it necessarily ruins the character, but it does feel a little bit off. Despite that, again, you know, it's just a lot of great stuff. You know, Far, Far Away ends up being a great location for these characters to interact with. It becomes a major location in these movies because it's a perfect way of like, okay, here's all these different characters interacting, and you know, it's much more interesting, I will admit, than the first movie where it's like, okay, we got a swamp and then we just go to random places and they just happen to be there, like, you know, like Robin Hood or whoever. With this, they're pretty much like, okay, we're gonna have this whole sort of Hollywood-esque town that has all this stuff, and again, it works because even the sequels fully understood, like, yeah, this is probably the best way to have these jokes happen and have these characters interact with each other. And of course, you still have to go back to the element of the parents, which I do think, you know, it is solid stuff. Like, you have Julie Andrews as the mother, and I like the fact that even though she's mostly just there just to basically try to calm down the king, you can clearly tell that she's overall bothered by the whole situation, but it's like, look, I'm trying to keep my cool. The father, of course, John Cleese, one of his best performances as far as I'm concerned. I do love his whole progression because it's like, you know, you can tell that from the get-go that he's not going to be the actual villain of the movie, but at the same time, you do see like that whole progression of like, okay, he's being an actual as to Shrek, finds out that there's someone who's even worse of an as about it, and it's like, look, I can't just kill anyone because he's being forced into it. It's like, okay, well, I'll try, even though I kind of don't want to ruin my daughter's love for me or whatever. All really good stuff, you know, and I do like the little twist that they have, even though it becomes very obvious once you watch it again, and especially as you're an older viewer. It's like, okay, his wife's name is Lillian, like lily pad. They talk about how they used to walk down by the lily pads and whatnot. There's a lot of frog themed stuff, and of course, hey, what other fairy tale story had like a true love's kiss thing that transformed a green creature into a royal being? It is a clever twist, even though, you know, like I said, once you watch it again, once you see it as an adult, it's pretty easy to figure out, but I still think it's well done the way they plot it out. And while talking about it, as watching it as an adult, obviously this movie is entertaining to kids. I mean, it was a big hit, but I do think that if there's anything that people really need to acknowledge about these things, is that if it was just a kids movie, it wouldn't have gone as far as it did. And I think that realistically, this is kind of an adult comedy that people only think is a kids movie. Well, I mean, aside from the fact that, you know, it was marketed towards them, but because it's animated, which of course comes back to that whole stigma of animation where, you know, hey, we treat anything that's animated as a kids movie, because it's like, you know, if you made this a live action movie, it would probably have gotten a higher rating, even if they never changed anything else, but it would definitely be remembered more in line with like your 2000s comedies than it would be as a family feature. Like, of course, kids can still watch it. I mean, there's a lot of comedies that are like PG-13 that kids have watched. I mean, you know, Dumb and Dumber, you know, was something that I watched as a kid and I loved as a kid, even though it's technically not supposed to be a kid's movie. So I don't see that this would have been any different. I mean, you know, hell, you know, since I mentioned Meet the Parents, that's another one where it's like, you know, I watched it as a kid, enjoyed it as a kid, and, you know, not really a kid's movie. And that's the thing, is like, this movie, like, if you look at the way the characters talk, it doesn't feel dumbed down for kids. The story itself doesn't feel like it's for kids. It's really just the fact that it's animated that makes it feel like it's for kids. And I'm not here trying to say like, oh yeah, animated movies that are, marketed towards kids are all secretly adult movies. Because there are a lot of them that, yeah, they're marketed towards kids because they are for kids. But this is one situation where I'm like, yeah, this is marketed towards kids, but if I'm completely honest, I wouldn't really call it a kids movie. Obviously, I still would say that it's a movie that kids can enjoy. It's obviously a movie that kids, will watch, but it is one of those things where like it's kind of like going back to something like the Flintstones. If you go by TV, you're like, I mean, it's it's definitely enjoyable for kids, but was it made for them? And I kind of don't think so. Like, I'm sure, yeah, mentally they were like, okay, we got to make the toys, we got to do all that stuff, but the approach to the story itself, just to me, is like, if it wasn't for the fact that this was filled with colorful characters, this would not really be something that kids would automatically latch onto. They might watch it with their parents and enjoy it, but it wouldn't be like the one that they would pick out from like the toy aisle, is what I'm saying. Because, like I said, a lot of the stuff really makes more sense, or only makes sense if you're an adult. Like, the stuff with Fiona and Shrek arguing as a married couple. It's like, I mean, kids will understand it, sure, but I feel like that stuff is more effective as you're an adult than it is for kids. Honestly, I feel like those scenes are stronger watching it now, because I'm like, not that I didn't get it when I saw it as a kid, but knowing those conversations a bit more, I just feel like, okay, this is more relatable than I thought it was. I've never been married, just to be clear, but, that doesn't mean that I haven't had any kind of conversations that don't remind me of this, or remind me of this, whatever, you know what I'm trying to say. For the most part, it is a very well done thing that, like I said, I've been saying, adults could watch it and they'll be like, yeah, that's kind of how romance is. And, again, there's of course obviously the jokes that are aimed more towards adults, like when they're being, when Shrek and the gang finds out that, like, oh, the fairy godmother has been behind us all along, and she's Prince Charming's mother. There's a whole joke where they're referencing the OJ chase, and even before that actually starts, if you pay attention, there's a whole bit which I never really fully understood until watching it now as an adult, where basically you have like the headless horseman with some knights, and he's just kind of standing around and he's kind of pointing towards, the spot where his head would be. I as a kid, I thought it was just him showing off a trick, or him trying to explain that he's headless, not realizing that the whole joke was that, like, oh, look, he's doing like the alcohol test, but because he doesn't have a head, that's kind of the joke, because he's, pointing towards his nose, but we can't see that. So, of course there are those kinds of jokes, but that isn't entirely why say that this is a bit more for adults. Even though you could still watch it with your kids, and I still understand why some would call it a kids movie, but I would say, you know what, given the context, given everything, if this movie was live action, it would not be deemed as a kids movie. It would be deemed as an adult comedy that kids can certainly watch, because it's, on the lower end of the raunch and stuff like that. But it's definitely one where I'm like, if you want to argue about this being an adult thing and showcase that, yeah, animation can be for anyone, this one I would definitely understand arguing that it's more for adults, because it really does feel more like a thing that adults will get, more so than kids. And just the approach to the story, the fact that the characters don't really have the fact that they're going to be swearing or talking like adults would. Of course, it's not like they swear heavily. It's still a family feature, but that isn't really any different from a lot of the comedies that I've mentioned before, where, yeah, they may have some swears, but they don't go overboard. I don't know. Like I said, if it was released as a live action movie, or if animation had already been treated as well as it deserves to be at that time, I don't think it would have been marketed towards kids as much as it ended up being. I do think that as a result, that is why it became such a big hit, because it is a very funny movie. So I'm sure that you probably had some adults who probably took their kids, and then as hard as they were laughing, they were like, okay, we got to watch this one by ourselves. They probably took their kids as well, but it would not surprise me if there was a lot of adults that watched it on their own just because it's very funny. I mean, even the first Shrek was very funny as an adult's movie, but I do think that this one is a bit more on that, just because of the topic of like meeting your in-laws and dealing with that stuff. But the way it goes about tackling fairy tales, of course, I understand that stuff is still more for an older audience in terms of like you kind of have to know how fairy tales work and kind of have to feel some cynicism in order to feel like, okay, we can tear this down a bit and mock the ideas. Of course, in a way that feels respectful. Yeah, that's all the stuff that I think I really love about Shrek. Shrek 2, good movie. I don't think it's as good as the first movie, but I understand it. It's very funny. It's filled with more iconic moments, and yeah, it's definitely a really good sequel that just continues the story really well. And I think we can close it out on that. This has been Octaviano Macias. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you again next time.
Fiona?
No!
Oh, thank heavens. Where is she?
She's on her honeymoon.
Honeymoon?
Thanks for stopping by. Go ahead and follow this channel. Subscribe, like, and comment. Ring the bell for notifications. Go ahead and also follow my podcast. And give some love to my Patreon account while you're at it. It's www.patreon.com/saicams. Again, thanks for stopping by, and I hope you come back for more in the future.